and welcome to Under the Umbrella. I'm your host, WDTN Plus meteorologist Melissa Barrington. The purpose of this show is to highlight various aspects of weather and how they impact our community. Our choices of topic will be far and wide-ranging, and a new topic will be each week. Today, we are joined by Philippe Papin, a hurricane specialist from the National Hurricane Center in Miami, Florida. Hello, Philippe, excuse me. How are you today?
Doing great. Glad to join you here this morning.
Okay, so first question is how did you become interested in weather, and how long have you worked at the National Hurricane Center?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It's a long-winded question for me. So I've actually been pretty interested in meteorology and weather forecasting for a long time. I can actually go back to a moment when I was a kid in Greenville, South Carolina, growing up. And we were directly impacted by a tropical storm, Jerry, in the year 1995. And that was a very active hurricane season. But because we were directly impacted by the tropical storm, it produced a lot of flooding in the Greenville, South Carolina area. I became kind of very interested in trying to understand, well, why did this system cause so much damage in the area? In fact, it was a little bit of a fear that initially motivated me to start following the weather on a more regular basis. But I would actually record the local news segment of the local news affiliates that were in the Greenville, Spartanburg region in South Carolina. And then over time, just by kind of following the weather on a regular basis, starting that hurricane season, my fear kind of turned more into a fascination of how the atmosphere worked and how these people are able to properly predict it over long time scales. And so from that time onward, I've always just been fascinated with meteorology, and I've decided to make a career out of it. And so really it's been quite a path from that very humble beginning as a kid in South Carolina. But now I've been here at the National Hurricane Center. This will actually be my fifth hurricane season since joining the building in 2020.
Okay, so for folks who don't know a lot about weather, can you give some brief ideas of how a hurricane forms and how do you forecast one?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And so typically during the hurricane season, when you're looking for the formation of the sort of more generic term is called a tropical cyclone, but that encompasses tropical depressions, tropical storms, and hurricanes. When you're looking for the formation of one of these systems, there are a number of larger scale atmospheric conditions that we basically look to see whether or not the environment is sufficiently favorable. One of those ingredients is very warm ocean sea surface temperatures. And so typically the threshold is 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 26.5 degrees Celsius. That allows you to start getting development of sufficiently organized showers and thunderstorms that can grow and develop into a tropical storm or hurricane. Uh, in addition, you also need sort of the wind throughout the column of the atmosphere, basically all the way from the surface of the ocean all the way to the top of the atmosphere, to be relatively consistent. We call this vertical wind shear, and we actually look for the vertical wind shear, the change of wind with height, to be very low through that deep layer, because that allows those showers and thunderstorms to grow vertically upright directly over where that counterclockwise rotating circulation is developing. And so the final ingredient is in order to continue to have those showers and thunderstorms that continue to grow and develop the wind circulation, you need a sufficiently moist environment. And so basically very high relative humidity over, again, that deep layer of the atmosphere surrounding the storm. And so those three ingredients you look at on a regular basis, in addition to some sort of seedling system or disturbance that takes advantage of those favorable conditions for us to be able to predict when a system may become a tropical storm or hurricane.
Okay, so a lot of folks take vacation in hurricane-prone areas, and some of those can be a little bit further inland, like the Carolinas, for example, or even into the Tennessee or Kentucky. But even if they're going to the coast, folks are vacationing. What do they do, or what do they need to do if they're going to a hurricane-prone area?
Yeah, no, that's a great question because I mean, the hurricane season spans quite a long period in the Atlantic Ocean from June 1st to November 30th. So, what's the best way to kind of prepare yourself, especially if you know you're going to have a vacation in one of these hurricane prone locations during the kind of closer to the peak period of the hurricane season in August, September, and October? And so, what I always recommended is it okay if I share my screen right now?
Absolutely.
Perfect. And so, I will actually bring you straight to our webpage here, which should be able to show you the National Hurricane Center webpage, which is hurricanes.gov. And so this is the primary webpage that we use for most of our forecasting endeavors here. All right, and so you should see this right now. This is the landing page, but if you just type into your URL hurricanes.gov, the very first graphic you're going to see is actually what's called the Tropical Weather Outlook. And this is a product that we issue 4 times a day, every day during the hurricane season, basically June all the way through the end of November. And we basically provide an outlook of the possibility of tropical storm or hurricane formation across the Atlantic Basin. We also have a companion product for the East Pacific Basin. So if you might be vacationing kind of in the southern coast of Mexico, we also cover that basin all the way across the Eastern Pacific Basin. And so in this case, this is a nice graphic because it'll tell you how much activity we're expecting, at least over the next week. Fortunately for today in the Atlantic Basin, it's very quiet. We're not expecting any tropical cyclones over the next 7 days. And you can see this outlook was issued at 8 a.m. this morning, the 5th of June. In the East Pacific, we are actually monitoring a system for development right now that's just off the coast of Mexico. And the colorization here indicates the probability of formation of a tropical storm or hurricane. And so in this case, it's actually in the high category. And so for those that are planning for a vacation, especially as it's approaching, I would just say stay tuned to the latest updates in hurricanes.gov, which will show you the latest information from the Tropical Weather Outlook. There's also the Climate Prediction Center, which does outlooks for out to 2 and 3 weeks into the future. And they have similar products that are also covering those time ranges for tropical cyclone formation, both over the Atlantic and Pacific basins.
Okay. Can you remind folks what is the difference between a hurricane watch and a hurricane warning? This is definitely something that you hear even with the tornado watch and warning. People still get confused. And for folks here that aren't used to hearing about hurricane watches and warnings, can you explain what they are? And can you also explain a little bit more about the cone of uncertainty and what it may mean to affected areas and what's new this year?
Right. No, both excellent questions here. So let's just talk about watches and warnings first. And so there are a number of different types of watches or warnings that we issue here at the National Hurricane Center. I'll focus on the tropical storm and hurricane watches and warnings, but a watch indicates the potential for those hazards that are being highlighted from that product. So like a hurricane watch in this case would indicate the potential for hurricane conditions to be affecting a region of coastline that area has been issued. And this is typically a product that's issued 48 hours before the arrival of at least the beginning of tropical storm conditions. So that way it gives people the necessary time to prepare and potentially evacuate if they're going to be in harm's way with an approaching storm. A warning is a little bit sooner in time frame. 36 hours is typically when we issue that product to the start of the tropical storm conditions. And now that's upgraded. We're now expecting the potential hazard of either tropical storm or hurricane conditions, depending on whether or not it's a tropical storm warning or a hurricane warning. And then more recently, just in the past decade, we now also have storm surge watches and warnings, which focus exclusively on the inundation level of water near the coastlines as a hurricane approaches that's associated with a large pool of significantly raised rip currents and tides that are associated with the storm due to a combination of its wind and low pressure. And that's a very dangerous hazard that we always like to highlight. Again, with those same timeframes where a watch is issued 48 hours before for the potential and a warning issued 36 hours with the expectation that those conditions are going to be realized.
Okay. And what is the current forecast here for the 2025 season?
All right, so I'm going to share my screen again so you
Okay.
can see kind of the latest, what I would call the seasonal outlook here. So you should be able to see this right now, but this is a consortium of partners, both at the Climate Prediction Center and the National Hurricane Center, and also the Hurricane Research Division that have come together to produce this seasonal forecast for the 2025 Atlantic hurricane season. And it's a probabilistic forecast, so we're actually assigning probabilities to the likelihood of overall activity. And so you can see for 2025, the greatest probability here is in the above normal category. So we are at least leaning towards a potential for another above normal hurricane season this year. 60% is that probability. But you notice that there is also a 30% chance it may just be in your normal season, and then a 10% chance of below normal conditions. And then we also have a range of named storms, hurricanes, and major hurricanes here on the right side. where we could expect anywhere between 13 to 19 named tropical storms, 6 to 10 hurricanes, and 3 to 5 major hurricanes. And this is exclusively for the Atlantic basin for this hurricane season outlook.
And when do we typically see most hurricanes develop?
Right. And so we have just started the Atlantic hurricane season as of June 1st, but there is a relatively slow ramp up in overall tropical storm and hurricane activity during the hurricane season. In the first couple months, it slowly ramps up, but really by the time you get into mid to late August, you see a significant increase in the overall activity across the basin. And actually, I'm going to share another little graphic here and some of our resources on our webpage here. If I go and just look at what we typically expect, we have this nice plot called a campfire diagram. And so hopefully you can see that. Make
Yes.
sure I'm sharing
Yep.
the right graphic
Yep.
here.
I see it.
And then so you can see there's a relatively slow ramp up the first couple months, June and July. There is some activity, but it's relatively low. But starting August 1st, you can see there's a significant increase in the number of tropical storms and hurricanes that occur in a typical year, with the peak of the hurricane season happening during the first week of September. And then you see sort of the similar ramp down in August into November, with the season ending by the end of November.
Okay, thank you very much. We are going to take a short break. And when we come back, we are going to talk about a few impactful hurricanes to the Ohio Valley. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back to Under the Umbrella. We are joined today by hurricane specialist Philippe Papin. And we want to talk a little bit this segment about the Ohio Valley and how we are impacted by hurricanes. And one of the first questions I have for you is, where do most of the Ohio Valley storms come from? Do they come from the Gulf? Is there a favorable track? Where do they typically come from?
No, that's actually an excellent question. It's maybe a little bit of sort of a misnomer, as you kind of may have alluded to. Most of the Ohio Valley area is affected by storms that primarily kind of come from the Gulf of Mexico. And I'm once again going to try to share a graphic to help illustrate that a little bit here. And so let me share that screen.
Perfect.
And I'll zoom in a little bit on the graphic of interest. So this actually shows you the total number of tropical and subtropical storms that occur during the first 10 days of September. But this helps to nicely illustrate kind of what I want to describe here, where it's really related to the large scale steering currents across the Atlantic Ocean, where most tropical cyclones are forming kind of here in the low latitudes, either in the Atlantic Basin, Caribbean, and Gulf of Mexico, and then basically undergo this very slow turn, essentially clockwise, as it goes around a large scale ridge that's typically parked very close to the island of Bermuda. And so for that reason, a lot of the storms that form well out in the Atlantic Basin are actually turning to the north and recurving out into open waters, or affecting the eastern US seaboard in the months of August and September. However, systems that form a little bit closer to home here in the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf form a lot closer and may also feel those effects of that large steering current, but are primarily being drawn to the north and ultimately to the northeast. And so if I kind of highlight where Ohio is here, you can see that's part of the reason why the majority of the systems that are affecting the Ohio Valley area are coming from the Gulf of Mexico, just because of those steering currents bringing those storms further to the north and northeast, basically directly from the Gulf into the sort of central and eastern portion of the United States.
Okay, so here in Ohio, actually, some of our most impactful storms have been actually since 2000. And so I want to highlight a couple of storms. There was Ivan in 2004. Then we had Ike, which I think was our most impactful one at 2008. And then Helene most recently in 2024. And all of these storms have appeared in September. Is there a reason why it's September? And it seems like we end up with a letter I named storm frequently, with the exception of Helene. It's like HI. It seems like we're in the middle there.
Yeah, that's definitely been common the last few years, where it's those named storms in the H or the I list, basically getting about 8 or 9 letters down the typical hurricane season list, that have been pretty impactful systems. But As we kind of alluded to in the first part before the break, September is actually the peak of the Atlantic hurricane season when we typically expect the most activity all across the Atlantic basin. And so that does also include the Gulf, where a lot of these storms have originated from that moved northward and have affected the Ohio area. And so it's not that surprising to see September being that kind of most impactful month for you all, because there are a lot of systems that are originating in the Gulf that are moving to the north at that month during the hurricane season.
Now, Ike, it was unusual when it came through here in 2008. It brought high winds, didn't bring a lot of rain. Our highest wind gust was 69 miles an hour, which was the second highest on record since 1984 here. It was also one of the most costliest storms to affect our region. What was special about Ike?
Yeah, so Ike was obviously a very impactful storm, not just for Ohio, but also for the Gulf when it affected the area kind of on the Gulf Coast of Texas. And actually, I will once again share my screen to kind of show you the sheer size of Ike is really what made this such an impactful system. This is actually as it was basically approaching and making landfall in Texas as a Category 2 hurricane. And you might say, oh, it was only a Category 2 hurricane. Our scale goes from 1 to 5 of total hurricane categories based on wind speed. But the sheer size of Ike made it such an impactful storm because those winds were occurring over a very large area. It was able to churn a lot of very high recurrence and storm surges that was affecting the Texas coastline and was very impactful there. But also due to the fact that it was so large, it didn't weaken quite as quickly after it moved inland and lost that sort of source of fuel from the Gulf. And as you can see, moving off to the northeast, it very quickly also interacted with a sort of non-tropical mid-latitude trough. And so it quickly moved the system off to the east and northeast, producing a lot of very large swath of heavy rainfall. And Ohio itself was on the eastern portion of the overall counterclockwise flow of the hurricane as it weakened. And so that's typically considered kind of the most impactful portion of the storm, the right front quadrant or the dirty side of the storm that typically has the most winds and also the most rainfall associated with it. So that's really what made Ike such, unfortunately, a very impactful system during the 2008 hurricane season.
So it was basically the size of Ike that you were looking at, and it wasn't how strong Ike was that came in necessarily, because a lot of folks I think about like, oh, it was a Category 4 or 5, but in this case, it was a Category 2. You said, right?
Yes, that's correct. But again, category is just related to the wind speeds of a storm. In this case, because of how large the storm was, its impacts in terms of storm surge were much higher than a lot of other Category 2 hurricanes that would be on the smaller side or even a normal size storm. Ike was really in the upper echelon of size of systems that have developed and intensified in the Gulf.
Now, there can actually be a positive to hurricanes in some way, shape, or form, and they can bring some benefits. And one of those was Isaac. That was back in 2012. And can you explain how it helped end the Ohio Valley drought that year?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And yeah, obviously, not all tropical cyclones have the same impacts. And actually, Isaac was a case of a storm that was a little bit smaller. It made landfall in the Gulf as a Category 1 hurricane in Louisiana. And then as it moved inland, it quickly weakened and still was associated with a decent area of rainfall. But the rainfall itself was not very high. In terms of intensity, the rain rates were quite a bit lower as the system weakened and became a remnant low as it moved to the north across the Ohio River Valley. And you're right, at that time in late August of, I think, 2012, that region was under a very extensive drought all across the Midwest. And so ultimately, Isaac ended up producing a lot of beneficial rainfall across the Ohio area and ended up being a probably net positive impact for the region, helping to alleviate that pretty extreme drought that was occurring that year.
Do you, by some chance, have a list of the names for this year for the 2025 season?
I, in fact, do. So let me go ahead and pull that up and share my screen one last time. And if I do that right this moment, all right. So the list of names here is at the bottom here. So the first named storm for the 2025 Atlantic hurricane season would be Andrea. then Barry, Chantel, and onward. You can continue reading the list. Probably one of the newer additions, this was actually the same hurricane list of names that was used back in 2019. And so you may remember Dorian from 2019. That system was retired due to its impacts in the Bahamas as a Category 5 hurricane. And so that name has actually been replaced by Dexter this year. And so that's a one significant change from when this list of names was used back in 2019. But as you can see, the list goes all the way through W. We also have a supplemental list of names that also is included if we were to somehow exhaust these list of names this year. But I'm sure hoping we don't get to that point this year, even if we do have an above normal season.
So, what qualifies a name to be retired?
Right. That's a good question. So actually, that is typically the jurisdiction of the World Meteorological Organization. They actually meet amongst a variety of different countries for our area of interest in the Atlantic Basin. And this meeting actually takes place after the hurricane season occurs, sometimes during the month of March and April. And basically, all the countries come together. They present basically their cases for retiring a storm. And then there's a decision made amongst the committee members of the World Meteorological Organization on whether or not the storm was impactful enough to justify retiring it for that season. So the Hurricane Center does have some input, but ultimately this is the authority from the WMO that makes that final decision.
And who does the WMO also pick the names? And I've noticed like it goes male, female, and how many lists do you guys have?
Oh, that's a great question. So in fact, you're right. When a storm is retired, we do have a little bit of autonomy in being able to pick a replacement name. And so actually this past year, it was a collaborative effort where basically it was a survey amongst both the Hurricane Center building, some of the weather forecast offices, and other collaborative partners to determine a list of possible replacement names for the prior hurricane season list. And in terms of hurricane name list, it's basically a cycle of every 6 years. We actually have 6 different name lists, basically A through W here, that basically replace themselves every 6 years, where this list from 2025 will again be reused again in 2031. And so, for example, next year's hurricane season list will actually come from the same set of names that we used last in 2020.
Okay. Finally, just wrapping up, is there anything that you would like the public to know that they may not know about hurricane season?
Yeah, I mean, really, the bottom line is that no matter whether or not hurricane season is going to be active, inactive, it really just takes one storm to potentially cause catastrophic impacts across either the Gulf, off the eastern seaboard, anywhere in the kind of continuous United States along the coastline here. And so we just really say people need to be prepared well in advance of even when a storm is developing. And so it's really important to have kind of your hurricane preparation plan in place. Kind of think of a possible place that you may need to evacuate if need be, if you're near the coastline and you could potentially be in either a surge prone area or a flood prone region when these storms create these significant hazards. And so really it's just, you need to be prepared well in advance, regardless of what the overall activity of a hurricane season might be.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Philippe. He has joined us from the National Hurricane Center in Miami, Florida. We appreciate your time today. And thank all of you for joining us today on Under the Umbrella. If you have a suggestion or a topic, or you know someone who would like to be a guest, please contact me at melissa.barrington@wdtn.com and put Under the Umbrella in the subject line.